I'm Melinda Nusafora and welcome to Just2Degrees. An atlas of human suffering. That's how United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres described the most recent report issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this offering is even more dire than its predecessor, whose 1,000-plus pages were referred to as a code red for humanity. Guterres says the report is a damning indictment of failed climate leadership, an abdication of authority he calls criminal. The UN's expert panel on climate change asserts humanity is dangerously close to missing its last chance to save the planet. And while it makes for uncomfortable reading, its message can't be ignored. Claire Herriot has the details.
Sicker, hungrier and poorer. That's the future we have to look forward to, according to a damning UN climate report.
I've seen many scientific reports in my time, but nothing like this. Today's IPCC report is an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed climate leadership.
The IPCC assessment of our current environmental situation is broken up into 4 reports. The first outlined how our physical climate is changing. This second offering describes the real-world implications of those changes.
Every year, we have, I would say, between 20 and 40 million people displaced by extreme climate events. And every year, this number is twice or thrice the size of the number of people displaced by conflicts and violence.
The report explains that 3.6 billion people, more than 40% of the global population, are now living in the danger zone. That means that experiencing things like flooding, torrential rain, extreme heat, prolonged drought and runaway fires on a more regular basis. The most vulnerable communities are in West, East and Central Africa, South Asia and South America. Their chance of dying as a result of an extreme weather event is 15 times higher than the rest of the world.
There is a brief and rapidly closing window to secure a livable future on the planet. And we need to live up to this challenge. This is a decisive decade of climate action.
But importantly, the report also outlines action plans for how communities can best adapt to the coming threats, including the protection of key infrastructure, seawall construction projects, and the establishment of early warning systems.
We live in a tough world, there is no doubt. The report doesn't step away from that, but it does give us a roadmap for how we might negotiate moving forward in a challenged world.
The UN calls the lack of political leadership when it comes to the climate emergency criminal. Global warming is now irreversible, but to what degree remains firmly in our hands. Claire Herriot, TRT World.
For more, we're joined by Wolfgang Kramer, who is a lead author of that IPCC report, and he's also a director of research at the Mediterranean Institute for Marine and Terrestrial Biodiversity and Ecology. He joins us now. Wolfgang, thank you so much for your time. This is a very long, it's a very detailed report. I know it's a difficult question, but if you could just pick 1 or 2 elements, what stood out the most for you out of this report?
Yeah, first of all, the report has a very short and we hope concise summary that was discussed in detail with representatives from all governments of the world who in the end agreed that it was a useful summary. So I invite everyone to read that summary. You don't need to read the full report. And essentially what it contains is a confirmation of the fact that we see numerous impacts of climate change around the world and that the situation is degrading, but that we also see adaptation going on and that adaptation contains a lot of options for better environmental policies at all levels that will not fully make us avoid impacts of climate change, but that are greatly needed in order to reduce those impacts.
I'm going to get to some of those adaptation measures in a moment, but something that did stand out for me, and also in my reading of commentary around the report, is that this is the first IPCC report that has really discussed the mental health impacts of climate change. Talk me through why you think that was an important inclusion.
Well, there were Well, first of all, what our mission is to cover all aspects of climate change where there's scientific literature and findings about. So we have to just cover anything we can get. And when there is literature about something, then we will use that. There have been some mentioning before on impacts of climate change on mental health, but this is now more visible for various reasons. First of all, we have more dramatic impacts observed of climate change recently. We have also a greater recognition of people, and actually many people now are concerned, more concerned than they used to be. So there are studies that show that both children and adults are being afraid about the consequences of climate change in the future. And since these studies exist in the medical literature, it's our job to refer to them.
Let's move on to some of these adaptation measures that you briefly mentioned. There are ways that society can make some changes to adapt to what is going to be the inevitable changes in our climate. How should we be adapting? How should policymakers move forward?
Yeah, first of all, we need to recognize that not everyone is affected by climate change in the same way. And in many cases, it is poor people, either poor people in rich countries or people in poor countries who are particularly affected. So first of all, we need to recognize that their efforts to adaptation need our support from the north, from the global north. Now, what can they do and what are they doing? They're, of course, adapting the ways that food is produced, both on land and in the sea. That there's a lot to be gained from a package of activities that we call agroecology. That essentially means that we strive for greater diversity in agricultural and food production systems. And usually this allows us to be more resilient to climate change, and therefore is a means of adaptation. In other cases, when it comes to coastal risks, where there are, of course, there's a limit to where we can do, where we can build greater seawalls or otherwise change our infrastructure. In some cases, it actually means to move away from what is today the coast, and that is also seen as a form of adaptation. It is a very tough one. It's not a gentle thing to do, or not a pleasurable thing to do, but it's also an adaptation that is greatly necessary, and that is actually also taking place in many countries. So again, that needs support and needs to be managed well.
These are hard decisions, but you're right, now is the time to be making them. Wolfgang Kramer, we appreciate your expertise here on Just 2 Degrees. As we've been discussing on the program, the latest IPCC report has highlighted the impact of the climate emergency on people, especially those in vulnerable communities. Nigeria's capital, Lagos, is home to one of them. Makoko is an informal settlement built on sticks along the city's coastline. As Angela Yukamadu explains, the men, women and children who live there are trying to adapt to the storms and extreme weather that climate scientists have warned are becoming more frequent and more severe.
In Makoko, a floating shanty town in Nigeria, carpenters are hard at work, hammering metal sheets onto the bottom of boats. The aim is to stop the hull from breaking apart in the storms that climate scientists warned will become more frequent in the coming decades. Makoko fisherman Tanti Leon got caught in one such storm last year.
My boat turned upside down and I had to climb on it with my children until people passed and helped us. I was so sad I made up my mind not to fish again. But then, this is all I know how to do.
His home was also destroyed. Makoko is built on sticks and sits in a coastal lagoon opposite the mansions and towers of commercial capital, Lagos. It is just the kind of poor, informal settlement that is particularly vulnerable to climate change-linked sea level rises and extreme weather. The report from the IPCC said climate change is impacting the world faster than anticipated. Though Africa has contributed very little in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the world's hottest continent hosts some of those most vulnerable to the fallout from a warming planet. For Leon, his plan to adapt is to save up and buy a speedboat engine. It's tough paddling in a storm, he says. But his fishing net, empty but for bits of debris, illustrates another bleak assessment by the UN. Rising sea temperatures could bring down fish harvests. Yet another threat to his way of life.
Marine turtles are valuable in that they are ecosystem stewards.
Coming up on Just 2 Degrees, blasted by plastic. Dead turtles are washing up along the shores of the UAE. Is it a sign of worse things to come? But first, if the bees go, are they taking humanity with them? That story is coming up next. Albert Einstein is famously quoted as saying, "If the bees disappear off the face of the earth, man would only have 4 years left to live." Now, there's no proof he ever actually said it, but still, is it true? Reports linking a collapsing ecosystem and the collapse of humankind have been flying around for more than a decade. Zeynep Gökçe explains what all the buzz is about.
These winged creatures are not just here to make honey. Despite their size, bees have a huge impact on our world. That's why people panicked when honeybee colonies started disappearing in North America back in 2006. This was a result of what's called colony collapse disorder, or CCD, which scientists suspect is caused by either pesticides, mites, fungi, the use of antibiotics in beekeeping practices, or a combination of them. And the phenomenon became a global concern when it started showing up in Asian and African countries as well. But according to Dennis van Engelsdorp from University of Maryland, this is no longer the case. He surveys the bee losses in the US twice a year and says no case of CCD has come up in the past 8 years. And a recent study published in ScienceDirect.com reveals the number of managed honeybee colonies has risen by 85% globally since 1961. So, what's the problem? Well, it turns out there's other kinds of bees to worry about. A recent study in the journal One Earth shows that the number of bee species reported in the wild has declined globally. And the sharpest decrease happened between 2006 and 2015, with roughly 25% fewer species spotted, including the now rare Melitidae bees. Other pollinators are in trouble too. A paper published in Science Direct in 2019 shows more than 40% of insect species are declining, and a third are endangered, with butterflies and moths declining the fastest. For all this, scientists blame climate change, habitat loss, and pesticides.
The majority of these chemicals don't get sucked up by the crop. They go into the soil. About 95% of them goes into the soil. And they get into streams and ditches and so on. And then they can be taken up by the roots of other plants. So the bees, whether they visit the crop or whether they visit wildflowers growing nearby, either way, they're getting this constant drip feed of insecticide.
So how is all of this affecting us? Well, if it wasn't for these industrious anthophilia, many of the fruits and vegetables that are vital for our health would barely exist. According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, 75% of the world's crops rely on pollinators, particularly bees. But in all likelihood, if bees were to go extinct, humans would probably still survive, because wind-pollinated crops such as wheat, rice and corn would continue to grow. There's also the hand pollination option, but it's incredibly labour-intensive and costly. The world's wildlife would struggle, as they depend on certain plant species that pollinators take care of. And from a socio-economic point of view, farmers and beekeepers across the globe would go out of business. The decline of food supplies would increase costs, and this chain reaction would hasten the incidences of famine and malnutrition in just about every country on the planet. Despite these facts, the UK government just authorised the emergency use of thiamethoxam, a pesticide part of the infamous neonicotinoid family. Britain hopes it could help fight off yellows viruses spread by aphids. Most EU countries had banned its use back in 2018 because it paralyses bees and other pollinators. At the same time, Washington is getting ready to approve 4 types of neonicotinoids to be used on US farmlands. According to an article in The Guardian, this is a result of pressure from agriculture lobby groups and pesticide manufacturers. And for John Tucker, an entomologist from Penn State University, these seed treatments are marketed so well to farmers that they become scared they'll have a catastrophic outbreak of pests if they don't use them, even though it's unlikely. It has contributed to this toxic landscape across the country. But in the long run, the science is clear. More pesticides will lead to less bees, and less bees mean less food. And the thought of that just stings. Zeynep Gökçe, TRT World.
Dave Golson is a Professor of Biology and the Conservation of Insects at the University of Sussex, and he joins us now. Dave, do bees need a better PR team? I mean, they're so much more important than just for the production of honey.
To be fair, I think they do have a better PR team than many insects, things like wasps and earwigs and so on. But you're right. I don't think many people appreciate just how important bees are. Very briefly, 3/4 of all the crop varieties that we grow in the world need pollination by bees or some other insect pollinator to give a good yield, a full harvest. So everything from apples, strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, tomatoes, squashes, even coffee depends upon bees. So, we really need to look after them.
Dave, don't tell me our coffee is under threat here.
Well, it could be if we didn't ensure that we had healthy populations of insect pollinators. I should stress there's more than one type of bee. You've got a giant honeybee in the background behind you, and that's the bee that we keep domestically. But there are actually 20,000 different species of bee in the world, and they're all pollinators. They're all really important in ensuring that we get good harvests and that wildflowers set seed and continue, otherwise we would lose those too.
And yet, despite the apparent risks, we've got countries like the UK, the US, that are allowing certain pesticides, neonicotinoids, to be reintroduced into farming again. Just how damaging could that be for these pollinators?
Yeah, these are neurotoxins. They're incredibly potent poisons to bees. Just to illustrate, 1 teaspoon of one of these neonicotinoids is enough to give a lethal dose to 1.25 billion honeybees, which, it's hard to imagine 1.25 billion honeybees, but that would be enough to fill 4 big lorries with dead bees. And that's what you could kill with just 1 teaspoon. So applying hundreds of tons of these chemicals to our farmland, I think, is complete madness.
Why are they going down this route then? I mean, how do conservationists such as yourself encourage policymakers of the absolute importance that these tiny little insects play?
Yeah, unfortunately, the companies that manufacture these products are a very powerful lobby. They make billions of dollars a year from the sale of them. And unfortunately, bees can't afford lobbyists as they don't have the funding to combat that. So unfortunately, I think that explains why often the importance of looking after the environment comes second best to making money at the end of the day.
I mean, to support bee populations, we often hear advice about people having their own domestic hives in the backyard. Does that really make a difference? And does it depend what kind of bees you keep?
So the bees that we keep in hives are all one species. It's the honeybee, Apis mellifera. And actually taking up keeping bees in your garden, I hesitate to say this, but it's a bit like someone who's worried about bird declines, deciding to take up keeping chickens as the solution. They're two different things. The honeybee is a domestic animal, and keeping another hive in your garden or taking up beekeeping is just adding to the bee population. And unfortunately, that isn't a good thing, given that we know one of the reasons bees have declined is there isn't enough food to go around. So just introducing more hungry mouths to feed if you're not careful. So it's much more important if people want to help to plant flowers to create habitat for bees. And that is really effective. And everyone who's got a garden, however small, can get involved in doing that.
That is such wonderful advice, and we do really appreciate your time. Dave Golson, thank you so much for joining us on Just 2 Degrees. The invention of plastics was hailed as a revolutionary step for humankind a century ago, but with a lifespan of up to 450 years for a single plastic bottle, they've become a global scourge on land and almost every single body of water on the planet. The good news is that they're on track to forge a legally binding international agreement by 2024 to come up with sustainable, eco-friendly methods of plastic production, design and disposal. An intergovernmental negotiating committee will soon begin overseeing the process and ensuring international collaboration. But here's the bad news. The present impacts of plastic production and pollution, coupled with climate change, is a catastrophe that's been a long time in the making. Currently, the world produces around 400 million tonnes of plastic every year, and 11 million tonnes of it ends up in the ocean. Marine life are washing up dead on beaches alongside and full of the throwaway plastics we consume every day. Rahul Radhakrishnan has the story.
Hawksbill sea turtles usually live up to 60 years, but they're now an endangered species usually found in the warm waters of the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Gulf. But just off the eastern shore of the United Arab Emirates, they're washing up dead, and humans are to blame.
Normally, this area, what's the problem causing the turtle is mainly the boat strikes and ingestion of the plastic or foreign material and entanglement with a fishing net or a discarded net in the wild.
A majority of the dead turtles found here had eaten plastic debris, like bottle caps and plastic bags, which closely resemble their regular diet of cuttlefish and jellyfish.
Here, last 4 months, we already received 7 turtles. The same time, we already received many dead. We found many dead turtle, more than 15 or 20 dead turtle on the coast.
For the first time in the region, marine experts have begun researching the effects of plastic pollution on marine life. Their findings so far are staggering.
In our most recent study, we evaluated the marine debris ingested by green and loggerhead sea turtles from the eastern coast of the Sharjah Emirate in the United Arab Emirates. We found that marine debris was observed in 75% of green sea turtles and upward of 55% of loggerhead sea turtles.
This hawksbill starved to death. An autopsy on the turtle found the natural food items found in its gastrointestinal tract are shown here at the bottom of the screen. And the plastics and other debris which clogged its intestines and digestion are on top.
Each tray contains samples collected from an individual turtle, so each one of these comes from only one sea turtles, as you can see.
Studies estimates that plastics and litter in the oceans will grow to about 12 billion metric tons in the next 25 years, leaving the entire turtle population and other marine life in even greater danger.
There are many reasons to care about marine turtles. First of all, the marine turtles are in decline, so if there's ever a time to care about turtles, it is now, when the populations are threatened or endangered, depending on the species. But also in terms of just a pragmatic interest, marine turtles are valuable in that they are ecosystem stewards.
And if plastics don't kill them, overfishing, rising sea temperatures, and coastal overdevelopment, which can be seen across the Gulf, might. With the sea's natural inhabitants paying the ultimate price for our mistakes. Rahul Radhakrishnan, TRT World.
That's all we have time for on this episode of Just 2 Degrees. I'm Melinda Nusafora. Thanks for watching.